Not all depression is a disorder. Some of it is a signal. We've been taught to hear sadness as a malfunction. Something went wrong. Something needs fixing. And let me be clear from the start. This video is not a rejection of medicine. Depression is real. Treatment matters. For many people, therapy and medication are not optional. They are life-saving. But there is another kind of pain we don't know how to name. Some pain isn't chemical, it's symbolic. It shows up not as despair, but as numbness. As exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. As the strange feeling of living on autopilot, doing everything right, yet feeling quietly absent from your own life. So here's the question I want to ask you, not as a diagnosis, but as an invitation. What if your exhaustion isn't a malfunction, but a message you've been trained not to hear? Because here's the paradox of our time. We have more comfort than any generation before us, more convenience, more psychological language, more productivity tools, more dopamine at our fingertips than the human nervous system ever evolved to handle. And yet, rates of emptiness, burnout, and quiet despair keep rising. Not dramatic suffering, just a low, persistent sense that something essential is missing. You wake up tired before the day begins. You scroll, you work, you cope, you distract, and somehow life feels thinner than it should. This video isn't here to tell you that something is wrong with you. It's here to explore a different possibility. What if the question isn't what's wrong with me, but something far more unsettling and far more hopeful? What have I been living without? Stay with me. Pain used to mean something. Now we rush to mute it. There was a time when pain wasn't immediately labeled as a problem. It was treated as information. In traditional cultures, sadness wasn't something to be fixed overnight. It was something to be listened to. A sign that a person was crossing a threshold from youth into responsibility, from certainty into wisdom, from an old identity into a new one. Today, we've lost that language. To be clear, there is such a thing as clinical depression, a condition rooted in biology, neurochemistry, and nervous system regulation. And for many people, medical support is essential. But there is another form of suffering that medicine alone cannot fully explain. You could call it existential depression. Not the absence of pleasure, but the absence of meaning. Alan Watts once said, suffering begins when life loses play. Not play as entertainment, but play as aliveness, as spontaneity, as the feeling that life is something you're participating in, not just enduring. Modern culture treats sadness like a system error. A glitch to eliminate as fast as possible. We optimize mood. We manage symptoms. We scroll, distract, numb, medicate, hustle. Anything to get back to normal. But historically, sadness was often a signal of transition. Doubt wasn't weakness. It was the doorway to maturity. And that brings us to a familiar story. So many people in their 30s and 40s, especially in America, have lives that look fine from the outside. A stable job, a partner, a decent body. Health that's good enough. And yet every morning feels heavy. Not tragic, just empty. There's no dramatic breakdown, no clear reason to complain, just a quiet sense that life has lost its texture. This isn't always because the brain is broken. Often it's because life no longer feels alive. When every day is reduced to tasks, roles, and performance, the nervous system doesn't protest loudly, it withdraws. And this is where a common mistake happens. We try to fix the feeling before we understand the message. We assume all pain is pathology, that every discomfort must be erased. But when a signal is ignored, it doesn't disappear, it gets louder. Fatigue turns into burnout, numbness turns into despair, restlessness turns into depression. What if this pain isn't asking to be silenced, but translated? Because before we ask how to restore our energy, we have to ask a deeper question. What gives energy meaning in the first place? And that's where the real collapse begins. Not in the body, but in the loss of purpose itself. Motivation doesn't die first, meaning does. Most people think they're tired because they lack discipline, that they've become lazy, unfocused, unmotivated. But that diagnosis misses something crucial. As Fractal Wisdom puts it, when meaning collapses, energy collapses. Energy isn't something you manufacture through willpower. It's something that emerges when what you're doing feels worth the cost. When meaning is present, people can endure extraordinary difficulty. They'll wake up early, they'll sacrifice comfort, they'll tolerate pain, uncertainty, even fear. But remove meaning, and even the smallest task feels unbearable. This is why burnout doesn't happen only to people who work too much. It happens to people who work without a reason that feels real to them. Imagine two people with the same job, same hours, same paycheck. Person A experiences their work as contribution. It's not perfect, but it feels connected to something larger than themselves. They feel useful, needed, part of a living system. Person B experiences the same job as repetition, a loop with no destination. Emails that disappear, meetings that change nothing, effort that never turns into meaning. From the outside, their lives look identical. From the inside, they're living in different worlds. One feels tired but alive, the other feels drained before the day even begins. This isn't a personal failure, it's a cultural pattern. Modern consumer culture promises happiness through optimization. Better habits, better tools, better routines, more efficiency. But it rarely offers a why that can hold a human life. Now layer in automation, AI, productivity metrics, performance dashboards. Gradually, people stop being seen as living beings and start being treated like functions, output per hour, response time, engagement metrics. When you're valued only for what you produce, your inner life becomes invisible, and something essential begins to wither. So when energy disappears, we make another mistake. We look for more motivation, another system, another hack, another morning routine. But motivation is not the engine, it's the exhaust. You don't need more drive, you need something worth being driven toward. Something worth the discomfort, worth the risk, worth the effort. Because here's the truth most people never hear. A meaningful life isn't painless, but meaningless comfort is exhausting. When you don't know what you're suffering for, every demand feels like an insult. And this brings us to the next layer, the quiet grief that appears when you realize the life you're living may not be the one you ever consciously chose. You can grieve a life you never chose. Not all grief comes with a funeral. Some losses are invisible. There's no ceremony, no sympathy cards, no language for it. And yet the pain is real. This is existential grief. The sorrow that appears when you realize you've been living a life that doesn't quite belong to you. You're not mourning the loss of a person. You're mourning the loss of alignment. The version of yourself that never got to speak. The path you never paused long enough to question. The inner voice that slowly went quiet because it was inconvenient, impractical, or unapproved. So many people say the same thing in different words. I did everything right, and I still feel empty. They studied what was sensible, not what was a lie. They chose careers that promised safety, not meaning. They followed the script. Graduate, work, earn, upgrade. Believing fulfillment would arrive later. But later never comes. This kind of pain is often misunderstood because it doesn't look like clinical depression. Clinical depression can feel like an inability to feel anything at all. A biological shutdown. A heavy fog that flattens emotion. Existential numbness is different. You can still function, still laugh, still show up. But underneath it all, there's the sensation of acting in a role, playing a character you've become very good at portraying. You smile in meetings. You answer questions automatically. You say, I'm fine, and almost believe it. And then in quiet moments, something aches. Here's where people often turn against themselves. They say things like, I should be grateful. Other people have it worse. There's no reason to feel this way. So they invalidate their own experience. They gaslight themselves into silence. But gratitude doesn't heal misalignment. And comparison doesn't create meaning. This grief isn't a sign that you're ungrateful. It's a sign that your inner life and your outer life are no longer speaking the same language. The soul rarely protests dramatically. It doesn't scream, it doesn't riot. Energy fades. Curiosity shrinks. Life becomes efficient, but empty. This withdrawal isn't punishment, it's protection. Because something in you knows that continuing to live disconnected from yourself comes at too high a cost. This realization brings us to a deeper question, one that Alan Watts pointed to again and again. Meaning doesn't come from roles, scripts, or optimization. revisit something modern life has almost forgotten, the sacred role of play. Play isn't childish, it's sacred. When Alan Watts spoke about play, he wasn't talking about entertainment, not hobbies, not leisure squeezed into the weekend after exhaustion. He was pointing to a way of being. For Watts, play is action that isn't enslaved by outcome. It's what happens when you do something not to prove, optimize, or justify your existence, but because something in you wants to move, explore, or express. Play is life remembering itself. The problem is that modern life leaves almost no room for it. Everything becomes measured, tracked, optimized, KPI, ROI, metrics, growth curves. Even rest has to be productive. Even self-care has to improve performance. And slowly, the soul gets suffocated. You can see the difference instantly. Watch a child at play. They're not trying to get anywhere. They're not worried about results. They're fully present, absorbed, alive. Now compare that to how most adults move through their days. Calculating, bracing, rushing, waiting for the next checkpoint. The same is true for artists. The moment creation becomes solely about reward, likes, money, validation, something essential drains out of the work. But when someone creates from alignment, from curiosity, from the sheer joy of expression, you can feel it. Their eyes are alive. Their presence is grounded. They're not performing life. They're inhabiting it. This is what it looks like when someone is living from their nature, not just their obligations. And here's a subtle but devastating mistake many people make. They tell themselves, I'll live once everything is handled. I'll relax once I'm successful. I'll enjoy life after I earn it. So life becomes a checklist. Graduate, work, save, upgrade, repeat. But the list never ends. And when play is postponed indefinitely, existence narrows into survival. Survival mode is efficient, focused, goal-oriented, but it's also emotionally sterile. You can survive for a long time like this, long enough to forget that something is missing, until the body starts to rebel as fatigue, until the mind goes numb, until the soul withdraws. And that's why a life without play eventually feels like depression. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something essential has been excluded. Play doesn't mean abandoning responsibility. It means reintroducing aliveness into it. And once you understand that, a new question emerges, one that doesn't ask you to fix yourself but to listen more carefully. If your energy is gone, if your enthusiasm has faded, if life feels strangely distant, what part of you has been ignored for too long? The question isn't what's wrong with me, it's what part of me is being ignored. Let's say this clearly. Again, this perspective does not reject medicine. If you're struggling with clinical depression, support matters. Therapy matters. Medication can matter. But even with the best treatment, there's a question no prescription can answer for you. What have you been living away from? So much of modern suffering begins when we turn inward with suspicion, constantly asking what's broken, what's deficient, what needs correction. But there is another way to listen. Instead of interrogating yourself like a problem, you begin to listen like someone who's lost touch with something precious. You ask quieter, deeper questions. What part of my nature did I silence to be accepted? What did I abandon because it didn't fit the role I was supposed to play? What version of myself have I been postponing indefinitely? This isn't about dramatic life changes, not quitting everything, not burning your life down. It starts with honesty. Here's a simple practice, not a hack, not a routine. Notice 2 moments in your day. First, when do you feel alive, even if you're tired? Not comfortable, not praised, but internally awake. It might be while creating something no one sees, helping someone without recognition, being alone in nature, speaking truth when it costs you a little. Now notice the opposite. When do you feel dead, even if everything is fine, safe, predictable, approved? These moments aren't judgments, they're information. Your body already knows where meaning lives. It signals it through expansion and contraction, energy and numbness, and this is where many people make the final mistake. They wait for clarity before permission. But meaning rarely arrives fully formed. It returns in fragments, in impulses you've learned to ignore, in longings you've dismissed as impractical. You don't need a new identity. You don't need to fix yourself. You need to remember. Remember what brings you into presence. Remember what makes effort feel worthwhile. Remember what part of you wants to participate in life again. Because meaning doesn't come from optimization, or performance, or improvement. Meaning doesn't come from fixing yourself. It comes from remembering yourself. And once that remembering begins, something subtle shifts. Depression no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a message that's finally being heard. And that brings us to the final question. The one that leaves us not with answers, but with an opening. What happens when you stop treating your pain as a defect and start treating it as a guide? Not all depression is a disorder. Some of it is a signal. After everything we've explored, it's important to say this one last time. There is no single explanation for suffering. You might need therapy. You might need medication. You might need rest, time, or support you haven't allowed yourself to receive yet. And none of that makes you weak. But there is another possibility we often overlook. That you're not broken. You're not failing at life. You're not defective. You may simply be disconnected from meaning. From the parts of yourself that were never meant to disappear, only postponed. From the quiet impulses that didn't fit productivity, approval, or survival. From the sense of play, contribution, and aliveness that once made effort feel worthwhile. When that disconnection lasts too long, the soul doesn't shout. It whispers. It whispers as fatigue, as numbness, as the strange sense of watching your own life from a distance. Alan Watts captured it beautifully. When the soul is ignored, it whispers as sadness. When it's heard, it returns as life. Hearing it doesn't mean you'll suddenly know what to do. It doesn't mean clarity arrives overnight. It simply means you stop arguing with the signal. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin listening for what's asking to be remembered. So before you leave this video, I want to ask you something. Not as a diagnosis, but as a reflection. If this resonated, tell me in the comments. What feels missing? Not in your mood, but in your life. And if you want to keep exploring these questions, not to fix pain, but to understand it, then you're welcome here. Because here, we don't rush to fix pain. We learn to listen to it.